I think we can start now. So welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you all with us today to discuss such a timely topic as the state of participatory and deliberative democracy from both empirical and theoretical perspectives and at the different scales of national, European, and global. Within our brilliant panel of participants, consisting of Charles Girard, ANNABELLE LEVER, GÜNTER TOLKIEHN, STUART and FARSAN GHASSIM, we will proceed to a friendly critique of citizens' assemblies in order to assess their capacity to be more responsive to citizens' needs and concerns, and not only as tools that may be useful to political elites to deal with people's resentment, frustration, and distrust at low cost. The panel will proceed as follows. So first, I will make some introductory remarks to situate and contextualize the growing phenomenon of citizens' assemblies and to problematize some of their main issues and challenges. Then Cécile Laborde, who is Professor of Political Theory at Empirical College, will chair the first panel. In this panel, we will listen to two political philosophers, Charles Girard and ANNABELLE LEVER, who will give us conceptual and theoretical insights on participatory and deliberative experiments and specify their complex relationship to democracy in general and to representative democracy in particular. Then we'll have a short coffee break, and I will chair the second panel, where we'll have the pleasure of hearing two empirically or more empirically based interventions. The first will be presented by GÜNTER TOLKIEHN, who is a former veteran citizen panelist of the first European Citizens Panel, organized in the context of the Conference of the Future of Europe in 2021. And the second presentation will be co-presented by STUART and FARSAN GHASSIM, and they will address the question of what citizens' assemblies can bring to democratic governance. So that's all for now. And I would like to once again thank our participants and also the great organizational support provided by Catherine O'Sullivan from the Maison Française d'Oxford and from our amazing Julie Adams, who is just in the office next to us and who did an amazing job helping. So thank you all very much. And we can begin this friendly critique altogether. In the context of a society of generalized distrust, as Pierre Rosanvallon put it, citizens' assemblies made of randomly selected citizens have been presented as playing a crucial role in improving citizens' sense of ownership and trust in their institutions and elites. A citizens' assembly is a deliberative democratic process in which a group of randomly selected individuals representing a cross-section of the population come together to deliberate on specific issues or topics of public concerns. These assemblies typically involve participants in informed discussion, deliberation, and decision-making processes aimed at reaching consensus or recommendations on the issues at hand. The key feature of citizens' assemblies is their inclusiveness and representativeness, as participants are chosen to reflect the diversity of the broader population rather than being elected or appointed officials. These mechanisms are often used as a means to complement or supplement traditional forms of democratic governance, providing an avenue for citizen engagement, deliberation, and input into policymaking processes. The growing enthusiasm for citizens' assemblies explains why more than 80,000 citizens around the world were randomly selected to participate in a deliberative process between 1979 and 2023. So more than 80,000 citizens, randomly selected. Yet, after 40 years of steady growth in the use of participatory and deliberative experiments, only 1/3 of OECD citizens trust that their government would adopt the opinions of citizens expressed in a public consultation. The situation is even more alarming in the EU, where, despite the significant growth in citizens' assemblies at both national and transnational levels in recent years, nearly 3/4, so 72%, nearly 3/4 of European citizens surveyed by the OECD in 2021 said that they didn't trust their political system to allow them to have a say in government decisions. So the question is, how can we understand this discrepancy between the proliferation of experiments based on public consultation, in which citizens are formally invited to have their say in political decision-making, and the persistence of this great distrust on the part of citizens who feel that they are not being heard by their elites? This question is crucial and urgent in the context of polarized and distrustful societies. Citizens' assemblies are extremely costly, and if they are not sufficiently perceived by distrustful citizens as tools that truly enable them to make their voices heard, the promise of more participatory democracy may soon backfire, super-infecting an already highly disunited and polarized citizenry. In this panel today, and in our two panels, we'll try to address this challenge together. And although I can't develop it now, my view on this issue could be summarized as follows. We urgently need to shift the focus from the institutional to the citizens. Indeed, citizen assemblies have mostly been approached in an elitist and institutionally focused way, and that's especially the case for my specific research object, which is the European Transnational Citizen Assembly. For most political scientists and officials, citizen assemblies are still primarily viewed as a way to reduce the widening gap between citizens and political elites, while increasing trust in institutions. For example, in the words of the European Commission, I quote, "Promoting new forms of citizens' participation will increase trust in our union." This pragmatic, even instrumental approach to citizen assemblies, which aims primarily to reconcile the ordinary citizen with decision makers, praises the social utility of these tools in that they would do a good job of building trust and mitigating conflicts, dissensus, and polarization. However, I think we should question much more these overly positive spillovers of citizen assemblies described by wishful thinking officials and some armchair deliberativists in terms of building trust and reducing polarization. In fact, they may very well be counterfactual when actually in use in real-world experiments, for mainly two reasons, among others. The first is that the theoretical trust-building effect of citizen assemblies may be severely limited to the extent that public consultations are used primarily by public officials to craft recommendations they can brush aside as they see fit, leaving deliberating panelists with the sense that they were convened less as citizens than as consumers, gathered in a fig leaf marketing panel to help officials take the pulse of their constituency. Second, the capacity of citizen assemblies to mitigate the divisions and the polarization inherent in citizenry can also be severely limited in cases where public consultations are organized in response to mass protests in order to contrast the civilized deliberation of a small group of enlightened citizens with the wide protests of the madding crowd, as was the case with the French Great Debates after the Yellow Vest and with experiments organized in the wake of Brexit. If citizens' assemblies are designed to separate the wheat from the chaff, they are likely to fuel an already latent resentment among citizens who feel that some voices weigh more than others. In this context, and in the normative approach that I'm currently developing, I argue for a Copernican revolution in exploring the possibilities of participatory and deliberative democracy from the citizen's perspective, and not anymore from the elite or institution perspective, in order to improve the design of citizens' assemblies in the sense of being specifically more responsive to the specific concerns of distrustful and polarized citizens, especially in the EU case. Instead of assessing the capacity of citizens' assembly to restore trust of citizens in their elites and institutions, which is basically the elite-centered perspective, I claim that we should urgently address the discrepancy between the theoretical enthusiasm for citizens' assemblies and their difficulty in actually delivering, and we should try to prevent the promise of citizens' assemblies from backfiring into democratic disillusionment. Now, before I give the floor to my colleagues, I would like to suggest some of the research questions that we should try to address all together today. And of course, we may come back to them in the discussion and also in the discussion with the audience. So that this is a blueprint, a theoretical blueprint that I suggest we can think about during this panel discussion. And the three questions are, so first, how can citizen assemblies be better articulated with representative and direct democracy to truly serve the interests of citizens and not just officials and institutions? Second question, how can citizens assemblies better reflect and not just filter and respond to the specific needs and concerns of distrustful and polarized citizens gathered in ad hoc experiments? So this question concerns the deliberating citizens randomly selected in the citizens assemblies, whereas the third question concerns the whole citizenry and especially the non-deliberating citizens, the ones who are not randomly selected. So the macro public, not the mini public. And the third question is, how can citizens assemblies better bridge the gap between randomly selected citizens deliberating in cafe idle rationalized citizens assemblies and their non-deliberating counterparts in the macro public sphere? And from here, I give the floor to Cecilia.
Thanks very much, Aliano, and congratulations in organizing this event today and getting this wonderful panel together on this beautiful English bank holiday. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm delighted to have my two friends and colleagues here, Charles Girard and ANNABELLE LEVER. I think Charles will begin. Is that right? Do you want to start? So Charles' talk is entitled Democratic Principles and New Republics, How to Assess the Value of Citizen Assemblies. And you have
2025.
Well, thank you so much to the European Studies Center and especially to Alina Ballanger for putting together this workshop. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to our discussions. So I've been asked, as a way of introduction to this first panel, to address the following question: how should we assess the democratic value and the democratic legitimacy of citizens' assemblies from the point of view of normative political theory, and in particular democratic theory? Deliberative mini-publics, which combine deliberation, sortition, and sampling methods, give rise to high hopes, deep concerns, and sometimes also sharp mockery. They've been both celebrated as a revolutionary innovation, heralding a new age for democracy, and they've also been denounced by others as a populist threat, undermining the authority of democratic institutions. So what are we to make of such claims? So my modest suggestion in this presentation will be that we should discard any exclusive view of democratic representation in this conversation, be it applied to elected assemblies or to assemblies created by law. By the exclusive view of democratic representation, I mean any view that singles out a particular political body as the only place where the voice of the people can truly be heard. So we should reject criticisms of citizens' assemblies, which are based on the assumption that the people of the citizenry can only speak through their elected representatives. And we should also discard, I think, justifications or defenses of citizens' assemblies, which argue that no, in fact, they are the ones that offer some kind of genuine reflection of the deliberate will of the people as a whole. So we should not ask what kind of assembly is legitimate in standing in for the people. We should rather consider how these non-elected bodies can help realize democratic principles and can sometimes undermine democratic principles, depending on their specific settings, on the specific tasks assigned to them, and on the larger institutional and legal context in which they fit. Okay, so I'll start by considering briefly democracy as a set of normative principles, in order in the second step to compare the democratic value of sortition and elections. And finally, I consider some competing claims regarding the legitimacy of citizens' assemblies, mainly making points about how not to assess it. Okay, so democracy from the point of view of normative political theory is not a single procedure such as voting, nor a set of institutions such as the institutions of the electoral system. It's an ideal that is a set of normative principles which might be realized to various degrees by different institutional arrangements. The meaning of this ideal, of course, is contested, but it seems clear to me it brings together some procedural elements and some substantial ones, as suggested by the famous formula of government of the people, by the people, for the people. So for a very, very minimal account, let's say that on the one hand, government by the people, democracy requires some form of political autonomy, equal participation of some sort in decision making. On the other hand, government for the people, it requires something like the pursuit of the common good, or at least of just outcomes, aiming at decisions which are maybe equally advantageous for all, or more modestly, which produce a sufficiently just distribution of the burdens and benefits which are associated with decision making. Okay, so these very general principles can be interpreted in many ways, but however we understand them, they are not satisfied simply by organizing election or establishing a right to vote. Universal suffrage is a necessary condition for democracy, and we have you, but this doesn't mean, of course, that it is sufficient in any way. Two important insights of democratic theory in the last half century like this too. First, the idea that political participation is not restricted to participation in elections. Citizens are politically active, not only in the voting booth, but also in parties and unions, in social movements and in associations, in the workplace, on the market, in the streets, and in life, and so on. And the consequence of this very simple idea is that the elected representatives cannot claim that they are the only one who can legitimately pretend to speak for the citizenry. And I take this in a nutshell to be the rough general insight of participatory democracy. Second, democratic decision-making does not only require voting and some form of majority rule as a way to settle disagreements, it also requires some form of collective deliberation, where opposing views can be expressed and where disagreements can evolve before we settle them. So the public exchange of opinions and reasons makes it possible for each citizen to make her own mind and for all citizens collectively to reach a decision while being informed by the facts and the beliefs and the interests and the values which have been expressed in public deliberation. The general idea is that some form of equal participation in deliberation is as important to political citizenship as equal voting. These two ideas are not exactly new. You can find them in some of the classical accounts of modern representative democracy, for instance, in John Stuart Mill, but they've been elaborated upon and revived in the past 50 years. First, in reaction to a powerful intellectual movement claiming, since Schumpeter at least, that for realists, democracy simply means elections. And these ideas have also been revived and gained some kind of influence also in activist circles in the context of the so-called crisis of representation to which Aliénor alluded, in reaction to the growing distrust being expressed towards elected representatives. Okay, so this is for the very general presentation. What then are the implications, practical implications of such ideas? The main institutional innovation inspired by such ideas probably are deliberative mini-publics. That is, participatory processes in which randomly selected groups of citizens are invited to deliberate on a given political issue, so energy policy, electoral reform, legalizing abortion, for instance. And these deliberative mini-publics combine, on the one hand, face-to-face deliberation, generally among a few hundred persons, under the guidance of moderators, often with the intervention of experts, stakeholders, political actors, and on the other hand, the statistical techniques and sampling methods, which are usually used by pollsters to create representative cross-sections of the population. One of the first and most influential cases are the deliberative polls championed by James Fishkin, which allow for measuring the evolution of the views of the participants between the start and the end of the process. And so deliberative mini-publics have been organized at the local, regional, national, even in the European case, supranational level, sometimes mainly as experiments in social sciences, sometimes as consultative bodies, and much less frequently, they've been given some kind of binding power when they had to draft a proposal that was ensured to then be put to a referendum. Okay, so those deliberative mini-publics have clearly captured the attention of democratic theorists, and I would argue that this attention is maybe disproportionate to the extent that much less attention has been paid to other crucial implications of deliberative democracy regarding, for instance, the regulation of mass media or internet governance, but I'll leave this aside. Some democratic theories try to establish the democratic value and legitimacy of deliberative mini-publics, or the lack of value and legitimacy, by trying to demonstrate that sortition is inherently more democratic than elections as a mechanism to select assemblies, create assemblies. Or conversely, that sortition is inherently less democratic than election. So I think this is a misguided way to look at the problem, which still reflects the kind of narrow procedural view of democracy. So first, there's some kind of historical argument which is often made. It's often pointed out that from the ancient Greek city-states to the small republic of the Italian Renaissance, democracy has been associated with sortition, and aristocracy has been associated with voting, as, for instance, Bernard Manin famously established. But this finding, or at least its meaning, is often misunderstood. What Manin and others showed is that the value modern politics gives to consent and to choice explains why the new republics at the end of the 18th century put aside sortition and adopted massively in a very short span of time election as a mechanism to select assemblies. So this doesn't prove, as is often argued, that modern governments are not democratic. It only proves that they are not democratic and they cannot be democratic in the same sense as ancient democracy were, which should be obvious. It leaves completely aside the normative question of how should we understand democratic principles today in modern regimes, and what should we understand to be their institutional implications. Okay, now the analytical arguments generally focus on some kind of comparison between sortition and elections in the light of democratic principles. But I think this exercise shows that neither of them, in fact, is a perfect democratic method which should be identified with democracy. So let's start with political autonomy or government by the people. Elections allow us to choose as equals, more or less, but they give us unequal chances of being chosen. So on the one hand, they ensure what we can call equality of impact between citizens at the stage of the selection process. On the other hand, elections give citizens unequal chances of being chosen because the very logic of election is for voters to select the candidates they deem to be the best, whatever the criteria of the best is, based on ideology, alleged competence, social status, perceived similarity, and so on and so forth. By contrast, sortition creates equal chances of being chosen, if we don't look too much at the sampling methods, equal chances of being chosen, but it eliminates any possibility of choosing others. So the equality of impact between citizens at the selection stage is replaced by a total lack of impact. And in both cases, the inequality of impact at the decision-making stage remains absolute. So in the first case, absolute inequality of impact between voters and elected representatives. In the second case, between citizens who've been chosen by lot and citizens who haven't. And this is the very simple reason why replacing elections completely by sortition would in fact disenfranchise most citizens, depriving them of any form of political impact at the selection or the decision-making stages. Now, moving to the second democratic principles, pursuit of the common good or government for the people. Sortition has some serious merits when we compare it to elections. First, it avoids some of the pitfalls associated with electoral competition. The frequent homogeneity in social profiles among politicians, the existence of shared biases which may be caused by common interest or common experience as a political group, or the proximity with lobbies and interest groups which heavily invest in long-term political trajectory. Second, it also frees deliberation from the kind of short-term reasoning which is induced by the pressure of the electoral cycle. And finally, it creates assemblies that better reflect the socio-demographic diversity of the population. So all these features have value, and I would argue all of them might have some kind of epistemic value when trying to reach a good decision. However, all of these virtues are matched by corresponding epistemic vices. Non-professionalization also means, of course, likely lack of prior specialized knowledge or competence, and also the likely lack of coherent political visions of the kind that is shaped by a long-term partisan commitment. Independence from public opinion makes it possible to be entirely indifferent to the views and to the interests of other citizens, or at least of some categories of citizens. And finally, bypassing the biases at play in elections also means making the selection process entirely indifferent to judgments about the citizens' values and the citizens' skills. And of course, by contrast, we know that elections offer mechanisms, very imperfect mechanisms, to try and make the selection process sensitive to perceived competence, to perceived responsiveness to public opinion, and to political views or ideologies. So if we take seriously this comparison, it appears that neither election nor sortition appears to be a fully or uniquely fitted, satisfying democratic method. And so the question should not be which procedure is the democratic one. And there's a vast literature dedicated to this question. The question should be, or the questions should be under which settings, to which ends, and in which institutional context are deliberative meaning public valuable or dangerous for democratic principles? This brings me at last to the question of the legitimacy of citizens' assembly. So the question I just formulated, I think it's the one that matters, but it's not the one which is at the forefront in public discussion, in some form of academic discussions about the issue. I'll take as an example here the case of the French Citizen Climate Convention, which was held in 2019 when the government was looking for a way out of the political crisis which had been opened by the Yellow Jackets movement. So 150 citizens were selected by law and sampling methods. They met over an eight-month period to make proposals in order to reduce drastically France's carbon emission in a spirit of social justice. And they eventually adopted a list of 150 proposals. And among those, some ended up being implemented, many ended up being waterbound, and a good deal of them were simply ignored. So the experience was widely perceived by the public as some kind of political stunt that failed to live up to its promises in terms of citizen participation. But I'm not going to analyze the outcome or the motivation, the obvious political motivation behind the experience. I just want to focus on the way the question of its legitimacy was addressed. So it was accused by some, and I quote here the president of the Senate, I think, to be an illegitimate gadget threatening the authority of parliament. And the assumption in such criticism was that in a democracy, election is the sole source of legitimacy, which was often said. Such a view, of course, is untenable. It cannot be the case, at least in political system, where a very important role is given to independent administrative authorities, expert agencies, judicial bodies, and so on and so forth. So there's no reason why, just like these other institutions, some forms of citizens' assembly could not derive their legitimacy not from sortition as such, or the absence of election as such, but from some of their specific feature and the way they fit with the particular task they are assigned. For instance, and this is, in my view, the most convincing case, the independence from political parties that citizen assemblies make possible offer a decisive advantage when it comes to designing new methods of voting in the context of electoral reform, which was the case in 2004 with the first citizen assembly in British Columbia, which was created specifically to suggest a new mode de scrutin. Okay, so it seems obvious that where elected politicians have some kind of structural conflicts of interest, we have potential reason to look for an independent body, and deliberative mini-publics are a potential solution. So that's just one example, but it seems to me that the central value which is given to choice and consent, and because of this to election in modern democracy, cannot mean that there are no other grounds for democratic legitimacy. But the CCC was also justified or defended by politicians and activists and academics, arguing that it was legitimate because it was standing in for the French people, for the whole citizenry, in a way the parliament never could. And this time, I quote again, it was announced, the French people will be able to make their voice heard directly and to express their will without any form of mediation. This idea, the idea that the citizens' assembly could stand in for the people as a whole, is quite puzzling to me. So clearly, to pretend that all French citizens express themselves through the CCC, it's simply a way to transfer this rhetoric of exclusive incarnation, which is often used in French politics, to an assembly drawn by lot. But there was a more specific idea which was at play, which has one of its source in the philosophical and with the literature in political philosophy and political theory. It's the idea that the deliberation of a mini-public would reflect what the deliberation of the whole people would be if the whole people could deliberate in the same way as the mini-public. So the CCC, in this logic, could let us know what an enlightened French citizenry would want. Okay, I think this counterfactual claim, which is very often made in the context of deliberative polling, is misleading. Even if the participants' opinion reflect at the outset the opinion of the wider population, it doesn't follow that they do so at the end of the process. First of all, deliberations which are held in similar conditions do not necessarily lead to similar outcomes. So it's unwarranted to treat the outcome of a particular process as revealing what would be the outcome of other potential processes. But furthermore, the counterfactual claim here has no clear point of reference. There's no sense in which the people as a whole could deliberate in the same way as 150 individuals do. So it makes no sense, I think, to claim, and I just pick up a few of James Fishling's book titles, to claim that deliberative mini-publics reveal the deliberate will of the people, the deliberate voice of the people, the deliberate thinking of the people. A different argument was that the CCT was standing in for the people for a different reason, simply because participants were ordinary citizens. And this is also an argument which is made in some parts of the literature. But here, being ordinary only means not having been elected, which is an insufficient, if paradoxical, ground for political representation. And this is all the less convincing as a deliberative procedure taking place over many months is bound to actually turn the participant into some kind of partial experts. So it's bound to widen the gap between their views and the views of other citizens. And in the case of the CCC, the participants clearly thought so themselves. They were offered the possibility to decide at the end which of their proposals would be put to a referendum. And they only decided to go this way for 3 out of 150 proposals, because they feared the electorate would disagree with them and would not follow them. A last problem with the ordinariness argument is that it obviously ignores the role which is played by organizers, by moderators, and of course by experts. So the influence of organizers, moderators, and experts may be unavoidable, and to some extent, it may be justified, as long as it does not deprive the participants from their agency, but it should not be forgotten. There's no way in which citizen assemblies can be said to be to allow for deliberation without mediation. Okay, so to conclude, the main simple claim I made was that the rhetoric of exclusive incarnation should be abandoned by critics of citizen assemblies, but also by their proponents. The question is not, are they legitimate in standing in for the people? This should not be the objective. There's a last problem I want to mention with this rhetoric, which is that it pits the citizens' assemblies against the parliaments. And this way of framing the issue creates a rivalry, which is not only about who's going to complete some specific task, but about who's standing in for the people. And such a competition, I think, is bound to weaken both sides to the likely benefit of the executive power, which is exactly what happened in France. From the outset, the scope of the CCC was much too broad. Its binding or non-binding force wasn't clear. And even the institutional outcome, decrees, debates in parliament, referendum, was left open. And so the government praised itself with all the leeway it was giving to the participants. But this setting made it, I think, inevitable that the CCC would end up proposing a long list of items, among which the presidency could simply pick and choose. So I think when we keep looking for the one procedure that will reveal the genuine will of the people, we end up being blind to the many ways in which it can fall prey to political capture.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so we take questions for both presentations at the end of the session. So I'll now move on to Annabelle for her presentation.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this lovely event. And if that's all right, it turns out I hadn't realised that Jean and I were thinking along similar lines when you invited me. I'm used to sort of mainly dealing with people who are totally gung-ho about citizen assemblies, and most of my work has been criticising them, except for my first one, where I fell in love with the nicest Citizens Council, and as I realised subsequently, I'm a little naive about it. Anyway, so my talk is divided into 4 parts. The first part is what's exciting about citizen assemblies. The second one is why is it exciting? The third one is what problems are there? And the conclusion I come to is basically something very much like Eleanor suggesting, which is to refocus citizen assemblies around intra-citizen deliberation. And I think that's really what is the most exciting thing about them, deliberative and so on. So let me tell you all about it. What's exciting about citizen assemblies? I think for me, from the outset, the first and most important thing about them is they create opportunities, deliberative opportunities for ordinary citizens as peers in an artificial but supportive environment with moderators, facilitators, and equal access to expert opinion. And they get to focus on something that's sort of a question of genuine public importance. And I just think this is wonderful, but I don't know about you, I'm an academic, there are all these things I don't know anything about. I'd love the chance to talk to other people about it in a way where we could share opinions. And so my feeling is, actually, that's what's really thrilling about them. They bring citizens together to talk about public policy, public questions in ways that are informed, supported, so no one really gets to dominate from the rest. Brilliant. I think that's just already sufficient. Second thing I think that's exciting about it, potentially, is the use of randomization and stratification to create suitably diverse, inclusive, and pertinent assemblies to discuss something that otherwise wouldn't be discussed. And I think that you already saw, really, this has been going on for a long time. So you saw it already with NICE's Citizen Assembly, which has been going for a very long time. And of course, randomization and weighting the stuff of public opinion polls. So in some ways, they're not new, but they are new, I think, in the sense of using them deliberately to create bodies that are inclusive and diverse and in different ways. Well, why are those two things exciting, I think? Isn't this incredibly banal? And the answer, I think, is we just have so few opportunities to talk together, to deliberate together as peers. And this is just really, I think, a major problem in our views of democracy, because after all, most views of democracy are premised on the idea that we do get to talk to each other about things that are difficult, and that we have lots of opportunities to do this. But in fact, most of us have almost no opportunities to do this. That seems to me that's just a fundamental problem. So having citizens' assemblies, creating things with money and experts and attention and mediation and help, I mean, it seems to me super cool. The absence of these opportunities, moreover, means that public debate's often conducted in ways and on topics that have limited appeal to most people, exacerbating feelings of alienation, cynicism, distrust, not only about politicians, but about the media, about judiciary, about experts as well. So I think what's really exciting about this is we don't have those bloody opportunities, not such nice ones, and the absence has been, I think, a disaster. And then thirdly, I think it matters. The evidence is people generally, although I gather not you, appreciate being a part of these things. They like and people who aren't part of them like the idea of them. They like the idea of finding out what their fellow citizens think in informed ways, even though most of them, as far as I can tell, most people who participate have some reservations about the way the deliberation was organized, the experts who were called, the question, so of course, being normal, sensible human beings, they've got all sorts of reservations about how things were realized. But the idea and often the experience seems to them very satisfactory and exciting. And so that seems to me something that is itself a good thing. And then finally, and this is something I'd like to think about more, but does seem to me really quite important. One of the things that these assemblies do that I think other things don't do as well, perhaps, is that they enable citizens to put the public and private aspects of democratic experience together in ways that are hard to come by, and that it's this mixing of the public and private and the chance critically and constructively to reflect on that, and the difficulty in a way of linking the two and distinguishing them, that is part of their appeal, I think. So these seem to me really, all of them, very sort of important, helpful and exciting. And in a way, what they seem to do collectively is help us see why our political rights matter, even when we don't really know how to use them. They often encourage people, I think, to feel that they might be able to use them in ways they hadn't thought of before. And it gives meaning, in a sense, to the idea of being a citizen amongst citizens, which seems pretty fundamental for democracy. But there is a core problem, which Charles touched on and also Eleanor, and I'm just going to recapitulate. And the problem basically is this, that most people can't participate in a citizens' assembly simply because they've been randomly selected. I mean, most of the literature is remarkably indifferent to this rather boring point. Most of us have work obligations, we have family obligations, but work obligations actually matter quite a lot. And so it's not like most of us can just drop everything, drop our lives to go and join the Citizens' Assembly because this utterly unlikely event of being chosen has happened. You know, given that we're almost uniformly not likely to be chosen, most of us are not going to plan on being available just in case. So of course, if and when we are chosen, most of us can't participate. And I just don't see how we change that, even with all this stuff about, you know, paying people and creating more things. Structurally, I think there are limits to how many of us are really going to be able to participate in a random assembly. And I think, not surprisingly, the average participation rate is really low. The average is barely 4%. Now, some of them are higher, some of them go up to about 15 or 20%, some of them maybe a little bit more, a lot of them are lower. We might hope to change this, and I think we should, you know, over time we could expect changes. But the fact of the matter is, most of us just can't drop our lives to take this on. So while we can create citizens' assemblies that look like us by using stratified sampling, so that actually the body that's created looks sort of like us on some dimensions, even though it isn't on others. The fact of the matter is, we're still just making a pretty picture out of a very small, deeply unrepresented body of citizens. So this 4% who are able to accept, you can make them, choose them, and massage them so that they look like us in some particular way. But at the end of the day, it's still a minutely unrepresentative body. And I think this has real moral, political, and epistemic implications for the way we should think about them. Finally, I think that's my final worry about them, is they're hugely expensive and complicated to run. Although I'm sure with practice and with more of them, all of this could be made a bit easier. And the power of organisers in particular, I think, needs really critical attention. Above all, I think care needs to be taken so that resources aren't diverted from other forms of engagement that might be just as satisfactory, perhaps more satisfactory, more spontaneously created, and so on, to this form. So I think that, you know, that's something to worry about. Still, I think if we drop the exaggerated and unpersuasive claims about the democratic legitimacy of citizen assemblies, particularly claims aimed at making them decisional bodies rather than deliberative ones, if we drop those, I think there's a hell of a lot going for these things. And when you drop the claim that these should be decision-making bodies that have some special legitimacy, I think you can also drop something else that I find deeply unpersuasive, which is this assumption that what we ought to do with our citizen assemblies is mimic descriptively as far as we can the citizen body. And you understand why you get this mimicking the citizen body if you believe it's got to be a decision-making body with legitimacy, because then you base the claim to legitimacy on descriptive representation. But if it doesn't have to be a legitimate decision-making body, then you don't have to worry about it looking like everyone else. And then I think you can start to do something that's much more exciting, which is try out lots of different ways of organising and representing us as citizens, depending on the topic at issue, the things you want to do. So if I can put it this way, once we've got over this fixation on trying to mimic us, bearing in mind, of course, that in absolute terms, as well as relatively, there are lots of nasty things that explain why our citizen body looks the way it does. You know, there are death rates, there's murder, there's suicide, there's ill health. You know, there's some nice things too. But the reason why some groups are bigger than others isn't necessarily a pretty story. So why we should want to mimic that in our deliberative representation seems to me not crystal clear. On the other hand, if the point of these things, as I think it is to enable citizens to talk to each other and to see themselves as peers, deliberative peers, then depending on the topic, you might be able to have assemblies that are made up just of welfare recipients, but where you aim to get as many different types of welfare recipients as possible. Or you could have assemblies made up of young people, maybe 16 to 30, and try and vary that on various dimensions. Or you could do it, and I think you probably should do it, on racialized minorities, bearing in mind that they come in lots of shapes and sizes and different quantities and so on. So the thought then is, once we get over this idea that they are decisional bodies that need to be legitimate and that somehow descriptive representation is the way to go, it seems to me we can start thinking constructively about how we might organize deliberation in ways that really helps both for us to think about the different things it means to be us, the people. Because after all, at sporting events and other events, we're perfectly happy to identify with all sorts of people who don't look remotely like us. They're all young, hyper fit, brilliant, and so on. And, you know, a lot of the time, most of us are able to identify with heads of state who don't look like us, you know, all sorts of symbolic occasions. And so I think we should try to use that for deliberative purposes and recognize we're a diverse population who can be represented by lots of different people who don't necessarily look like us at all, who don't think like us, but are nonetheless as much a part of us as we are. So that's one thing. The second thing I think you get by trying to do this variation is you get to find out what difference does it make to have an assembly that is made up of a majority of ethnic minorities. What difference does it make to the deliberations, to the questions asked, to the type of experts, the interactions, and of course to the outcomes? And that's true thing. So we just don't know. We have all these assumptions. We don't know because we don't get to try. And so I think one of the things that this will do is help us to learn more about how deliberation works, how our population thinks in ways that we don't normally get to see. And finally, because I think no one deliberates just to deliberate, even academics don't. I think the important thing about this is that all these different assemblies should be encouraged to provide either majority or even minority reports, summarizing their findings that are made public and can be used by others. So my idea of this is that really what you do with the citizens' assemblies is try to create intra-citizen deliberation that can be used by other citizens, either in local government, in national government, in interest groups, in universities. But above all, what you're doing is creating, or by us as voters, when we're trying to think about, you know, what should you do? You're trying to create a citizen conversation and a place in public life for citizens, qua citizens, with no special affiliation, no special knowledge, no special experience, beyond being what we all are, which is democratic citizens who are entitled to a say in politics, even though we don't have any special virtues, any special knowledge, or any special competence. And I think that, for me, would be really a major, major democratic advantage of citizen assemblies. And my hope is that once we get rid of some of this obsession about turning them into decisional bodies, with the naturally very elevated demands for legitimacy that come with that, and then this tendency, which you certainly see in all those dreadful OECD reports, to try and finalize the final way we ought to do it before anyone's even really investigated. I mean, it's mind-boggling stuff. We can start to actually see what works best in what circumstances when we want to deliberate together as citizens. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Annabelle. Yes, no, yes, you're less than your local time. 20 minutes.
20 minutes for questions.
Great. Would like to begin? David.
Not a very good question, really, right?
Say who you are, David.
We all know that.
I think, so listening to you,
So, good evening to the same very faithful audience. So it's great. We can just follow our conversation. And so all people who were a bit frustrated because they couldn't ask their question, you can ask your political theory question to Günther. I will be very, very grateful. So, welcome back to our panel discussion on deliberative democracy and citizen assemblies. In this second part, we have the great pleasure of hearing two papers. The first will be from Günther TOLKIEHN, whom I'm delighted to see again, this time in Oxford.
This time without a mask, so.
And then this time without a mask. I first met Günther in Strasbourg in the fall 2021. He was a former veteran panelist of the first generation of European Citizens panel, and invited to deliberate on the very long title ECP, which was something like economy, social justice, digitalization, news and sports.
Yeah.
And of course, you can immediately see the link between sport and social justice.
Yeah. Sport injury, yeah. Sport, obesity.
And Günther happened to be quite skeptical about the ECP process when I interviewed him many times after the conference on the future of Europe. And of course, in addition to being a randomly selected user of a Citizens Assembly, Günther worked in the IT industry before being appointed professor of business informatics at the Technical University of Applied Science of Wildau.
Yes, that's called.
In Germany. Then the second intervention will be conducted jointly by Stuart White and FARSAN GHASSIM. Stuart is a distinguished associate professor of politics at GÜNTER College at the Department of International Relations and Politics at Oxford, renowned for his expertise in political theory and democratic governance. And he will be joined by FARSAN, a junior research fellow in politics at the Queen's College of Oxford, whose research focuses on democratic innovation and public deliberation. So together they will assess the capacity of citizens' assemblies to bring something different and valuable to democratic governance. And I hope they will also talk about their current project on global assemblies. That's much more interesting than everything we did before. Oh. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Günther, and Günther, the floor is yours.
So, thanks for having me here. I had to add, before I went into the IT industry, I was working in basic research as an experimental physicist. So I'm doctor of physics. And then later I went into the industry. Then became professor for information technology. I have nothing to do with sociology and with political sciences. Only a user. Oh, should I speak a bit of that more? Yeah, no problem. If I faint, then please thank you. I wanted to first tell you a few words about my experience with the conference on the future of the big title of big project, and I was one of the lucky ones to be elected by chance. And I had the time, it was after I was retired, so I participated. in them. Yeah, and then the problems began. And my first sad experience was that the organizers did not tell us what the purpose of this is, what they were expecting of us. They just made micromanagement from session to session. They told us next session you do this, and then we split up the group and you do that. And when I asked what will we do tomorrow, do I have to talk about sports and can I change the group? No, you can't change the group. You have to talk about what we scheduled. But they had some concept, but it was not. For us, it was a miracle, and that was one thing that I did not like from the beginning. And then there were very many nice people there. The participants were really sympathetic and knowledgeable, partly. But as we had so many different subjects, it was good luck when you had in a subgroup of 20, you had maybe one or two who were knowledgeable about one subject, and the others said, well, yeah, okay. Please talk about it. I resign, and then the organizers they urged us. Yeah, but even if you have no idea, no clue, you must have an opinion. Please say what you think about it. I said, yeah, I think about it, that I know nothing and it's not interesting for me. Please go ahead. Anyone who wants. So that was really the idea of wasting my time. And the second, that was the first event where we met in Strasbourg. The second one was a telephone conference, a video conference with 120 participants. You can imagine how motivating that is. And after, and even then, they did not want to tell us what happens on the next day. Not on the next weekend. And then after that, I said, no, you can count me out. It does not make sense. I'm wasting my time here, I'm wasting the taxpayers' money. That was a little bit frustrating. I didn't, and additionally, they had the way of infantilizing the people, not only that they put the pressure on them what to talk about, they also did ridiculous games with them. Please make a drawing of what you think what the European Union would look like in 30 years. I'm too old for this shit. Yeah, so that was one not so nice experience for me. But I had some other experiences with citizen participation before that and afterwards also, but most of them before that. Local politics in my community, in my state, Hamburg, where I live, and also with some federal projects. In the experience there in part better than there. The most motivating experience was one motivating me to talk about this. The most motivating experience was one project where people in Hamburg had gathered and come to the opinion that Hamburg should rebuy the infrastructure for current gas and water and heating infrastructure. So because before it's too late, we had examples from London, from Berlin, where the privatization was drawing out, squeezing out any money of these companies, and then they said, yeah, now, okay, you cannot drink the water anymore, but it's still coming out. So, and then when the government was opposing, then they said, okay, well, you can put this, we give it back to you for 1 year. It's not going to anything anymore. So that is, so we had that was not a selected group. The people had organized themselves, right? They had come together and discussed and talked with the parliament and with some of the executive leaders in Hamburg. And all the completely there was they didn't want it. They couldn't explain why, but they said that cannot be done. It is against the neoliberal rule that everything must be privatized and even more. So it's the better, the more, and we cannot turn the wheel of history backwards. That was the only argument. So and we said, okay, well, if you don't listen, we had arguments. Of course, we did arguments. But at the end, we said, okay, if you don't want to listen, then we make a referendum. So we gathered. If I say we, I was only promising now to participate. There were associations organizing that and so on. We have a 3-step process until finally a binding law came out. And the politician said, well, that is the dawn of the city go bankrupt and everything will break down. Then it was done. After 1 year, they made good profit, and after 2 years, it was packaged down. Every reasonable person had anticipated. So this was a good example, but it is not what we are talking about at the moment. It has nothing to do with selecting a few people who have no idea about this subject, and then they wouldn't bring this into operation. So that is why I am a little bit skeptical about trying to make groups out of small groups out of the big population, and then think that they can do anything better than politicians can do themselves. It could happen. It's not excluded, but I think it's not very possible. And on the other hand, how can you make? We did not talk enough about the aspects of power here. It is about decision-making power. Just have a say. I can go into a pub and I can have a say every day to anything that I like. I'm doing my neighbor needs. So that is not the point. I found this motto of the conference on the future of Europe a little bit ridiculous. The people should have a say. It makes no sense to have a say if nobody listens. In Brussels, in Strasbourg, there was one politician for 300 so people, and they listened 1 hour on the whole weekend. So yes, but that is not communication. It's about power and the distribution of power, and it is about communication. Communication in the sense of Niklas Luhmann. We have 2 different systems. We have a political system and we have the general population that are different systems to work after different rules with different currencies, and that, these groups, these systems can communicate, but it is difficult. And Luhmann says that communication is in the first instance improbable. It does not work. If you want it to work, you must have not only one who says something, you must be heard on the other side. What you heard must be understood, and at the end, there must not be some, what is that called? It must proceed then there comes to a communication, and only then will something come out. If that is a good thing, it's another question, but if you don't manage to get this kind of communication, we will get nothing. That is the point where I have my doubts about any kind of group of people together, and they should now manage to produce communication between the general population and the political system. I don't believe it. I don't believe that can happen. So that is my skeptical view on this. As a practitioner, I read, of course, also a number of papers, political scientists, after I came to this discrepancy between the optimism that was that you also here have on this matter and that is published, and my feeling that it is a nice idea, but it cannot work. So I want to show you one view graph of one. First, I read contemporary publications. I did not really like them. So I said, wow, it sounds so theoretically. It sounds like people writing very eloquent and very educated about something that they really do not have a practical feeling for. They don't know what they are talking about. That's hard. This tendency, that was my feeling. So I looked for there must be older things, and that was. Yeah. Can you put this in the first picture? Then I stumbled over a publication of Sherry Arnstein. Everyone who would ever want to think about citizen participation should know this paper. I think it is really great. It is from 1969. Imagine that I had just the time of my life with people becoming a rock star. We had a newly founded band. We had the Summer of Love. At that time, she wrote this very critical article about. No, she's dead now. She's older than me. That's your excuse. It's a very good paper. If you read it after the first page, I knew that is someone who knows what she's talking about. And she said, well, I recommend to look at participation ideas in the form of a letter. It's only a rough approximation, but she said we find 8 steps on this ladder of 8 rungs. The first one is she calls manipulation. It's only that manipulation. You want to tell people what they have to do. The next is therapy. These 2 steps are called non-participation. Quite straightforward. That is what it is, and that is most of the things that I have seen up to now. Then next steps are informing, consultation, maybe placatation. She explains what she means with that. That is, she calls that is different in terms of tokenism. It is something more than just manipulation, but it is symbolic action. And only after that you come to degrees of citizen power, where citizens really can do something that has an effect on political action. Partnership, delegated power, nobody has thought about that. to know, oh, has talked about that. I understood. And of course, citizen control, that is, for instance, a referendum. Then the citizens say, no, we want this to be set up this way. So if you look at a project of citizen participation, I recommend have this in mind and look where you get with cooperating development on the out of the scale below the line. That had no influence on anything. And that is frustrating for the participants. If they notice that I had that also in local projects, you say, okay, that was a waste of my time, I never do it again. Yeah. I'm so negative, let's say, what if it doesn't work once, it may be work a second time. Perhaps, I don't know. But it's worthwhile trying, of course. Then if you come to the point where you can judge where do I get with this project, the next question is, what is it about? Participation as such is nothing. You cannot participate as such in politics. You have to have a focus. That was mentioned several times today. What is it about? In what do you want to participate? I have done projects on, so project management was one of my lectures. If you do a project that is similar to this can be seen as a project. Participation in the beginning, it had an end normally, otherwise it's institutional. And then you must have a goal. What do you want to achieve with this project? They never say that. If you say what we want to improve the confidence or the trust of the general public with the politics, that is not the goal that you can be correct. It can happen and it is nice. It's like world peace. You can have that as a goal, but you cannot do anything about it. It must be more specific. In which political decision making do you want to participate? That is something that I miss many times. Sometimes it is said we want to have people participate in the say the design of a new quarter in a town. Okay, but what is then the influence that the participation should take? That then come to this model again. It is only nice that we talked about it. You know that from psychologists. That does not help. So that was my statement so far. Thank you.
On the slogan of the conference on the future of Europe was "Make your voice heard," but it doesn't mean that we will listen.
That's right. The subjects, unwritten subjects.
Little lines.
Can you show the second one? It's just for 1 second. It's in the same article, maybe you have seen that. I find it really nice. 1968 style. I was in school at that time, last form. That was typical at that time. The students did this kind of.
Yeah.
We didn't have internet. We had to draw it on the wall of the toilet. This is great, I think. It means if you don't speak French, it means I participate, you participate, we participate, and they profit. Thank you. Thanks for thanks.
Okay, great. So we're almost 25 past and we finish at 6. Is that?
We have time.
We have. Oh,
The dinner is far.
okay. That just needs. Okay, so outline of what I'm going to say and how it's going to connect with what FARSAN's going to talk about. So I'll say a little bit first about why I think citizens' assemblies are properly seen as a complement to elected representation, not as a replacement. I'm just really going to assert that the spirit of what I'm saying there connects very much with what Charles was discussing earlier. I'll say a little bit secondly about different models of how citizens' assemblies fit into a wider political system with elected representation, and the different degrees of empowerment that these different models imply, and that I think connects to some extent with Einstein's level of participation, which GÜNTER helpfully introduced. I'll then talk a bit about some arguments for citizens' assemblies, particularly of the more empowered or empowering kind. Some arguments which I'm calling anti-elitist arguments, an argument which I'll call an anti-populist argument, and I'll talk a bit about the role of citizens' assemblies specifically in constitutional politics, picking up actually on something that was in Charles's presentation about the role of the Citizen Assembly in British Columbia in 2004, suggesting that new electoral system. All of my discussion is going to be really about at least implicitly about the nation state. So then I'll hand over to FARSAN, who's going to talk about the Global Citizens Assembly and some issues and research possibilities around that. So first of all, let me just, there is, as we know, that's why we're here, a lot of enthusiasm generally about citizens' assemblies or sortition-based assemblies. In my judgment, it's much too premature, to say the least, to argue for citizens' assemblies or sortition-based assemblies as a replacement for elected representation. You do sometimes see arguments of this sort. Alex Guerrero's, I think, excellent paper in Philosophy and Public Affairs from 2014 makes an argument for replacing elected representation with sortition. I think there's a flavour of this argument in Helene Landemore's book, where she calls for democracy 3.0 with a strong sortition element as an alternative to democracy 2.0, which is based on elections. But I think, you know, insofar as I'm here to defend citizens' assemblies, I'm not going to defend the replacement thesis. I think arguments for replacing elected representatives with citizens' assemblies to some extent overstate failures with elected representation. I'll say more about that in a second. And I think they overstate the confidence we can have in citizens' assemblies and the like as things stand. So I think the interesting kind of research and reform questions are all about how we integrate citizens' assemblies into a democratic system that also has elected representation and also, I think, referendums. Just to motivate the thought that elected representative systems are not terrible, this is an article which I came across when I was researching something completely different, an article by David Kalnitsky from 2022 in Critical Sociology, It's an article which is really engaged with sort of Marxist theories of the state and the sort of Marxist skepticism that you can make significant significant progress towards socialism within a capitalist parliamentary democracy. So Kalnitsky basically just looks in this diagram refers just to OECD countries, but basically what it's showing is with the arrival of representative democracy with universal adult suffrage or something close to it, you very quickly get the establishment of a welfare state, and welfare states, once established under representative democratic conditions, then tend, on average, in the long run, to grow. Even under half a century of what I would call neoliberalism, on average, in the long run, they still tend to grow. And so this, for me, is a sign that, if you think that welfare state expenditure is a good proxy for the common good and social justice, the substantive aspect of democracy, this suggests that there's reason to value universal suffrage and competitive party elections. We are getting something out of them. Okay, this slide hasn't survived the translation, but I'll try and describe what's going on here. So if we're thinking about citizens' assemblies and how they fit into a wider system, I think two questions to ask are, firstly, who decides whether there's going to be an assembly and what its focus is? And secondly, who gets to decide what happens to its proposals? So one model, which is overwhelmingly the kind of model that we see in practice, is that elected politicians or governments decide when there's an assembly, they decide what its focus is, more or less, and then they decide what happens with its proposals. But we can answer those two questions differently. So, for example, we could imagine a system in which citizens can petition to get a citizen assembly, and an assembly is automatically set up if that petition gets a certain level of support. In that case, elected politicians are no longer gatekeepers as to whether a citizen assembly happens on a particular issue. Citizens have their own control there. And we can also imagine a citizen assembly either having its own decisional authority or else having the right to refer its proposals to a referendum rather than sending the proposal back to the elected politicians. So if you put those together, you can imagine a system where citizens have the right to petition to establish a citizen assembly on an issue, and that assembly in turn can send a proposal to a referendum, and you've then created a channel of law and policy making that's independent of the elected representative system. And this connects back to GÜNTER's and Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation, the worry about having elected politicians control both ends is that you end up down the bottom of the ladder of participation with effectively non-participation. But if you've got different answers to these questions, then you can start to move up the ladder of participation and towards citizen control. So I'm in favor of thinking about empowered and empowering models of citizen assemblies. And some arguments for doing this. I mean, there's a current of argument that I've explored a bit myself, and which I think comes out of some social movements like Extinction Rebellion, which sees the existing representative system, notwithstanding David Kalnitsky's results, it sees it as unacceptably compromised by the power of money in politics. There's the idea that elected representatives are reliant on corporations or the rich to finance their campaigns, and this means that they are unduly sensitive to the policy preferences of the rich and business corporations. And on the sort of Extinction Rebellion type view, the way to sort of punch through that is to have a citizen assembly which is less, so the claim goes, less vulnerable to capture by the economic elite, and which can put forward policies that the rich or business corporations are blocking. I think there's another sort of variant of this anti-elitist perspective, which perhaps is more focused on the political elite, on elected representatives themselves, and on the thought that there can be situations where elected representatives develop a kind of corporate interest that doesn't align with the public interest, and that then again you need a mechanism to sort of break through that. So a possible, rather speculative example I would give here would be something like the post office scandal, which is currently news in the UK. This is a scandal involving a faulty software program which was used in the post office, which led to many people who were running post office being wrongly accused of embezzling money from the post office. It looks like the issue was understood quite early on, but a lot of powerful people ignored it. It's an issue where arguably the electoral representational system didn't do a very good job, because all parties, people in all parties stood to be criticised about their role in setting up the system and overseeing it. And so the kind of scandal broke really kind of came from outside of the political elite. And so my thought here is that you can imagine citizens having the right to petition for an assembly on an issue like the future of the post office, and this being a way to shine a light on something like this, where the political elite has perhaps sort of drawn sort of closed ranks and is preventing a properly open debate happening. So there's this anti-elitist argument for citizens' assemblies, which I've given a lot of emphasis to in my past work. A strong objection to this line of argument is that citizen assemblies or sortition-based assemblies may also in time themselves become vulnerable to elite capture. I think particularly models where we imagine people sitting in sortition-based assemblies for, say, 2 to 3 years, that gives lobbies quite a long time to get at them, and so we may see elite capture problems re-emerging there. And of course, if citizen assemblies fit into a petition and referendum mechanism, then again there are going to be opportunities for those with money to interfere both in the petition stage and the referendum stage. So we perhaps don't want to put too much weight on this argument, but perhaps there's also something to it. At the same time, I think there's also a way of thinking about citizen assemblies as a kind of anti-populism mechanism. So if we think of populism here as a concern about the potential within democratic politics for majoritarian decision-making to oppress minority groups, concern which is often expressed around the use of referendums. In the UK, it's often, you know, the Brexit referendum of 2016 is obviously a kind of very painful point of reference for lots of people here. And so citizen assemblies, I think, could also be seen as a way of responding to concerns about populism, particularly in terms of referendum-based populism. So one suggestion here is to use citizen assemblies as a way of producing impartial information for voters in referendums, which is something that I believe the state of Oregon uses. But I think more radically, we might think about proposals like no referendum without a citizen assembly approval. So a thought we might put on the table is that neither elected politicians nor citizens through a petition mechanism should be able to put something directly to a referendum without getting the approval of a citizen assembly. It's perhaps worth thinking about how the politics of Brexit and the Brexit referendum might have gone differently if the demand for a referendum had been channeled through a citizen assembly. Maybe, I think we would probably have still had a referendum, but maybe the referendum would have been worded or sequenced in a way that was different to what we had with Cameron. So the thought here is that citizen assemblies can serve as a mechanism for raising the deliberative quality of direct democracy mechanisms, an argument I laid to John Bergen. But in my own thinking, I think what I've increasingly started to think about is the particular contribution that I think citizen assemblies can make in constitutional politics. And to some extent, this overlaps with what I've said about referendums. But I'll add two further points on this theme. So the first point, I think, is that I think it's desirable that there is a separation in a democracy between ordinary politics and constitutional politics. I think it's very unwise to have a situation in a democracy where elected politicians have the power by themselves to change the rules under which they're elected. And one way you can restrict the power of elected politicians in that respect is to insist on approval in a citizen assembly as a condition for things like changes to the electoral system or other changes to the way the political system works. So a concrete proposal here would be that if elected politicians wish to change some part of the political system, then rather than being able to just go ahead and legislate that, they should convene a citizen assembly with an open question, e.g., what kind of electoral system should we use for elections to the UK House of Commons? And they should agree to abide by the reform they want, to go ahead with the reform they want, rather, only if that's consistent with the recommendation of the citizen assembly. In addition, so I'm pressing one button, we might also think about citizen assemblies in the sort of bigger project of making a constitution. And here I'm reflecting on the experience, for example, in Chile recently, where a constituent assembly to make a new constitution was elected. Its draft constitution then went to a referendum and failed in the referendum. And one possible kind of reading of why the process failed is that the constituent assembly was elected. If you elect a constituent assembly, the risk is that you skew the representation in the assembly to people who are more enthusiastic about the process. And so if you have more reformers voting in the elections to the constituent assembly, you get an assembly that's skewed towards reformers, and you get a draft constitution that's skewed towards the preferences of reformers. And then you've got a problem when it goes out into the referendum. The median voter may be to the right of the constitution that's being proposed, and you get the constitution draft constitution voted down. A citizen assembly, particularly if you stratify it to represent different views on constitutional issues, so that it's got proportionate representation of conservatives and reformers, looks like a way of preventing that kind of skew and therefore possibly making for a more successful process of constitutional reform. So everything I've said has been about, really, at least implicitly, about a nation state. So I'll now hand over to FARSAN, who's going to talk about the global context and global possibilities.